G'day folks, in front of you is quite possibly and potentially regarded as one of the worst modern graphics cards ever released. Let's review it and see how bad it is. Alright, so let's get started and introduce the card in question. So, this is based on the Navi 24XT variant of the RDNA 2 architecture, which is the smallest die yet inside of the series, featuring a 16 compute unit die with 1024 shader cores, 64 TMUs, and 32 ROPs. This also has the smallest amount of ray tracing capabilities and the smallest amount of AMD's dubbed Infinity Cache. This also is a controversial card in the fact it only has 4 gigabytes of video memory on a 64-bit memory bus, which AMD kinda, threw itself into a bit of a corner with, but that's not the point of this video. It's just worth pointing out because that's the limitation of this card. So, all in all, it's kind of a mishmash of interesting, but also very poor based on modern standards. The particular unit I have for this video is made by Gigabyte. It is their Eagle RX 6500 XT, which I think has slightly different clock speeds compared to the reference RX 6500 XT spec, but otherwise not too much different. It is a petite card with a small 2-fan cooler and a reasonably equipped, heatsink with some heat piping. It is still limited to 2 display outputs because of the fact this is a 6500 XT. And like all 6500 XTs, it requires a single PCI Express power connector due to the TDP of the card requiring it. All in all, a nice compact package. I just wish that, this wasn't packaged as a 6500 XT. Maybe it was probably more or less designed to be a 6600 cooler, but who am I to say, really? Since I mentioned the RX 6600, I actually managed to get a hold of one before this video went live, and I could actually use it for some comparison data. This is the MSI Armor RX 6600, which is basically a direct upgrade from the 6500 XT. It does require more power in the form of an 8-pin PCIe power connector on the PCB, and the card does have double the VRAM, double the memory bus capabilities, and all in all, the 6600 compared to the 6500 XT is just a way better card. And I'm really glad that I was able to grab a hold of this particular unit for this video so I could use it for comparison. Although it won't be a direct RX 6600 review, I wanted it to be here to use as a comparison point for data alongside the 6500 XT, so it actually really helps out. For today's review, I've tested the 6500 XT in both PCI Express Gen 4 as well as Gen 3 modes to see what the performance comparison is like, including the RX 6600. For my test systems, I used my daily driver AMD system for the PCIe Gen 4 testing results, and I used my secondary AMD rig, which I built on this channel, as a means of testing PCIe Gen 3 performance more realistically. The specs of the Gen 4 system include a Ryzen 7 3700X CPU paired with 32GB of DDR4 3200MHz dual-channel memory, as well as the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard. For the Gen 3 system, it uses an MSI X470 Gaming Plus Max motherboard with a Ryzen 7 2700X 8-core CPU paired with 16GB of 3200MHz DDR4 and dual channel as well. Both systems were tested with Windows 11 as the operating system, and all games were tested at the exact same settings. So without further ado, unless I missed any other factors, let's get right into it. Starting off the suite, we have Grand Theft Auto 5, a very old but still very popular game. Tested with the very high settings at 1080p, basically every setting that I could set to very high was set to very high, and all the distance toggles were set to their maximum, but no advanced options used. Also, any form of anti-aliasing was turned off. So the results you see on screen are representative of those test settings. And as you can see, all of the test configurations performed quite well. For some reason, the RX 6600 in the Gen 3 configuration had a weird 1% low. I'm just going to leave that down to testing error because, I was rapidly switching between applications, so potentially there was something going on in the background and that caused that frame dip. But trust me, it was actually representative of in between the 6500 XT and the 6600 when in Gen 4 configurations. So I'm just going to lead that down to there was a weirdness in the testing, so nothing really to worry about there. all the cards here did quite well, despite Gen 3 being a bottleneck to the 6500 XT. Another game that's quite demanding is Red Dead Redemption 2. In this case, I used Vulkan with 1080p resolution, although I used pretty much 1080p for all the games here, so no reason for me to keep stating it. Now, I used the Xbox One X equivalent settings listed by Digital Foundry, which you can look up online if you wish to know what they are. It's basically a mix of low, medium, high, and a couple of ultra settings, mainly just textures. And I did this to see if we could exceed the memory of the 6500 XT while in Gen 3 mode. And as you can see, it does definitely represent a massive performance dip when you do that. And as you can see, the 6500 XT suffers in PCIe Gen 3 mode, as it suffered quite a bit of frame dipping as represented by the 0.1% low. Now, of course, the footage you see on screen is just recorded from my main computer, but in actual testing, the card was really not up to trying to play this game at higher frame rates, at least when you average all of the results of the benchmark test together. It was struggling to keep the FPS in the low 50s to high 40 range sometimes, just because it was simply running out of VRAM. So definitely the RX 6600, even in PCIe Gen 3 mode here, has the clear advantage. Next up is a very popular game. Of course, this is Forza Horizon 5 with the medium settings and no FSR applied. You can see the results on screen. They really traded blows with one another. I do think that there was a CPU bottleneck occurring with the Gen 3 system because the results are basically neck and neck. So I'm just going to put that down to the 2700X is definitely bottlenecking the 6600. But either way, they very well performed close to another. Again, I tried not to exceed the VRAM of the 6500 XT, but even with the medium preset, it was teetering right on the edge. And before I started performing benchmark tests, I was getting low VRAM warnings from the 6500 XT on my main computer with Gen 4 performance. So, needless to say, you are cutting it really close with this card. However, it doesn't seem to prevent Forza from running happily at over 100 FPS on average. Although, I would still turn on a 60 or 75 FPS cap if you can, just to ensure that the performance will stay consistent. And also, if you ever did care to utilize FSR, that would also help if you were trying to push 1440p, but of course that's no guarantee due to the limited VRAM. And that's really only something you should do if you're running this on a Gen 4 system. But as far as the 6600 goes, well, obviously that trounces the 6500 XT a little bit, but really not much to make a huge difference. Both cards are extremely playable with at least 60 FPS in this title, although I could safely say you could turn on the high settings with the 6600 no problem as long as you had it in a Gen 4 system, and even then you probably wouldn't even exceed the VRAM, you should be good to go. The next game on the docket is Dirt 5, which does feature AMD ray tracing support, but for the initial test results I did not actually use those. I did use the low preset because this game will use over 4 to 5 gigs of VRAM with the low preset, surprisingly, which does top out the 6500 XT very easily, and I didn't want to use very low. As you can see, it definitely suffered from the low VRAM as a result of the warning in-game. And it only just gets worse when you apply ray trace shadows, which this game only supports ray trace shadows, at least with AMD cards. It could also apply to NVIDIA cards. I don't remember, it's been a while since I've tested this. Either way, the 6500 XT definitely does not qualify for a playable ray tracing card unless you were to employ some form of resolution scaling like FSR into the picture. And even then, the performance, well, it is consistent, it's not fantastic, and it definitely does not produce the kind of experience that you would expect from a graphics card within the $200 to $300 price bracket. But can it run Crysis? Well, specifically Crysis Remastered. The answer is yes, but barely, and not very playable at that. So, at 1080p high with no ray tracing, because I kept getting an error on startup for some reason with AMD cards with ray tracing, so that was disabled for me. Either way, that doesn't matter. The 6500 XT, at least at the high preset, was unplayable for pretty much the entirety of the first level. It did look pretty good, though, but frame times were trash, and it was kind of stuttery, and again, it just was not very playable unless you like a cinematic frame rate experience. And to make matters even worse, it was definitely cut off in frame rate with the Gen 3 system. So, all in all, I would say avoid the 6500 XT with the high preset if you plan to play this game. Although, honestly, you could do far better than a 6500 XT at the same price, I suppose, with all the graphics card pricing coming down as of the making of this video, so it's kind of a moot point. But in either case, the 6600 did much better in this game, and even though it was bottlenecked by the Gen 3 system, I would still say you could get away with playing at the high preset easily with a 6600 in comparison. Unfortunately, it's time to shame the 6500 XT once again. In Watch Dogs Legion, it just was unplayable. The frame times were not very consistent, and it kept running out of VRAM. Now, the high preset I know does use more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's intentionally why I did it for this particular game. And it does seem to clear up when you put it inside of a Gen 4 system. It does have enough bandwidth in that regard to clean up the stutter. But even still, the 6600 did a much better job here, even on the Gen 3 system. So unless you want to down your quality settings to medium or perhaps even low with a 6500 XT, I would just say you can't play this game with these settings on this card and expect it to work very consistently. I'm going to go quite quickly through these next test results because there's really not too much interesting here. So with Cyberpunk 2077 with patch 1.5, with no forms of ray tracing enabled, well, the 6500 XT just struggled on a Gen 3 system, no surprise there, it just ran out of VRAM. On Gen 4 it was okay, it was definitely playable, but not amazing, it was average. The 6600 did a much better job here overall. Turning on ray tracing, though, without any form of FSR at its bare minimum state, the 6500 XT just turns into a slop fest, and it just totally trips over itself, and it's unplayable. As you can see, the frame times were just done. There's nothing there to save it. The 6600 on Gen 3 was bottlenecked, but, it was still miles better than the 6500 XT. You can save it, though, with FSR, set to quality, but then it kind of turns a bit muddy into the visuals. It's definitely playable. Like, you could get by with playing it if you really cared about your ray tracing, but at that point, I would even just say get a 6600 and just live with that card instead, because you're going to get a much better ray tracing experience. The last AAA game I'm testing here is a little bit older. It's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, with the high preset and TAA anti-aliasing enabled, you can see that the Gen 3 RX 6500 XT benchmarks are not that great. It couldn't even hit 60 on average. Although, frame times, I guess, were a little bit more consistent than with the Gen 4 system, but either way, the card itself, it was playable, but honestly, not at the high preset. You might have to turn the anti-aliasing down or even off in order to save those results a bit. The 6600 is more consistent in the fact that the average frame rate was way higher, probably because it had more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM, which made me surprised that the 6500 XT didn't struggle any more than it did. But either way, I would recommend if you have a 6500 XT and want to play this game, set it to medium and then cap the frame rate. You'll probably have a pretty decent experience, although not perfect. I would almost say even low would probably be a better bet, just so you don't hit the FPS quite hard with running out of VRAM, especially if you have a Gen 3 system. Now for some indie games, if you will. This one's more survivalist based, and I've shown it before on the channel. This is The Long Dark. Testing with the Ultra preset, the 6500 XT, interestingly, was maxed out with this game. And it seemed like the frame times were a little bit better with Gen 3. Again, I think this is just down to testing variances. But either way, it seems like within run-to-run error of, well, the Gen 3 system and Gen 4 system, it does seem to saturate the 6500 XT completely. So at least with this game, there's no worries about running with the Gen 3 system, I guess, for the most part. I will note, though, that there were some inconsistent frame timing, and it did dip the frame rate quite hard on the Gen 3 system in certain areas, particularly where there was some advanced lighting involved. So there is that to contend with. However, I will say the 6600 is obviously a way better option for this game, just because of the fact it's got more raw horsepower. There is no ray tracing to test here, so what you see is what you get. I mean, you can turn the distance sliders up even more than what I've set here, but at the end of the day, I just tested with whatever the game's set as the preset default, so again, what you see is what you get. A pretty decent esports title called Golf With Your Friends is one I like to test for high frame rates as well as frame rate stability on this map called Worms, the most intensive one built into the game. And here things got rather interesting. So again, with the Ultra preset at 1080p, with none of the other settings changed, so that employs 8 times anti-aliasing by default, you can see that the Gen 3 results were both bottlenecked. Again, I think this is down to a CPU bottleneck because I was using a 2700X. So as soon as I moved to the 3700X, you can actually see, interestingly, that once again, the CPU was probably bottlenecking because the numbers are within run-to-run variances of each other. I don't happen to have a Ryzen 5000 CPU in my main system, so I'm just going to put this down to both cards were basically saturating my 3700X as far as the performance was concerned. So these should readily go above 240 FPS on average, no problem, as long as you have them in PCI Express Gen 4 mode. But if you're in PCI Express Gen 3 mode, well, I don't really know. I would suppose that they could support going above and beyond 240 FPS, maybe, but that would be only with a 6600. I think the 6500 XT would still struggle. Either way, more than playable with this game on both cards with those settings. And finally, I thought I'd test a game that absolutely hates AMD cards for some reason because it causes microstuttering all over the place. A Hat in Time is that game. Now, the settings are maxed out here. This game's not incredibly difficult to run these days on modern hardware, but it is DirectX 9, and it is such that when you do change settings and or you run it on certain hardware, like in this case AMD, where the optimization is just simply not there and it prefers NVIDIA, well, it can get really sloppy really quickly. This game is basically a Nintendo Switch port, if you will, and as such, of course, it prefers NVIDIA hardware. But it's not to say AMD hardware wouldn't run well, as the 6500 XT did okay, but in PCIe Gen 3 systems, there was noticeable frame timing issues. The game was micro-stuttering constantly all over the place, hence the 0.1% low on all results. So I would say moderate your settings, and that should clean it up a bit. You know, obviously don't play the game maxed out like I did for benchmark purposes. So I would say reduce the settings. You might have yourself a pretty good time with this game. No problems there. But it will micro-stutter even on loading screens and those transitions into the levels. So I would set your expectations appropriately. It will play just fine, but some of those little nitpicky things and attention to detail because of the lack of optimization definitely can hurt the gameplay. And that just goes to show, you know, the lack of optimization can definitely hurt the 6500 XT, particularly if the game runs out of VRAM on the card and in a Gen 3 PCI Express system. So now that we got the benchmarking out of the way, what are my thoughts on the 6500 XT? Well, they're going to be a little elaborate, so hope you don't mind the rambling. So basically, I mean, the 6500 XT, I could think of it as like a successor to the GT 1030, but the AMD version. Kind of like what you would dub in NVIDIA terms the RT 3030 or something like that. Without the RTX branding, it's like, it's not really an extreme card, but it does support ray tracing, so like the RT 3030, if you will. And let me explain. So there's a few different things that make me wonder about this card's longevity. The first of which is going to be in regards to, well, the overall functionality of the card. So if you think about it, this doesn't have any kind of media decoding capabilities or transcoding, if you will. I think that's a better word for it. This doesn't support the AMD Relive or Radeon Relive technology, however you prefer to call it. So you can't record your games directly on this card. That's not supported. And things like the AMD VCE for Handbrake or other applications like OBS is not supported. So this card does not support those technologies, which really begs the question, why even bother buying this thing if you can't use a graphics card for all its features? It just makes no sense. Probably because this was a laptop piece of silicon that was repurposed for desktop use to combat the shortage. I mean, that's about the best guess that we've come up with, but I don't know. I guess it really doesn't matter too much. That also brings me to my next point in regards to the PCI Express bandwidth. This only supports PCI Express 4.0 by 4, so that means that it's inherently limited, probably because of the laptop design, where it was only really going to be in a PCI Express 4.0 by 4 system. in the future, like an RX 6400M or something like that. Perhaps is maybe what this was designated for, a 6500M or something like that. I don't know. I've not done my research, so forgive me. I might be wrong on that, but it just, I don't know. Putting it in a PCI Express 3.0 system going into the future just is a bad idea. It's gonna be horrible for this thing as far as performance is concerned. You're gonna just hit bottlenecks, particularly with the raw horsepower of the card and also running out of VRAM. And speaking of the VRAM, you only have 4 gigabytes of the stuff. So even though it is technically GDDR6 and it's very fast VRAM, you're going to be on a 64-bit memory bus, and you're going to be just inherently limited based on the quantity of the memory in the first place. So you're already going to be struggling with higher settings in some games these days. And don't even think about, enabling the ray tracing on this card, because that's a bit of an afterthought. I think it's just there to complete the feature set, but that's about all it's got going for it. And I don't even think FSR is really going to be that big of a benefit. I mean, okay, maybe it might have some benefit, depending on the title, depending on the settings, and et cetera, but I don't think it's going to be like an end-all, be-all savior as far as VRAM consumption is concerned. That's just going to be a huge struggle, even compared to something like the RX 5500 XT, which has PCI Express 4.0 by 8, which is already better than this card by 4. Even though they're both PCI Express times 4, or PCI Express times 4, PCI Express 4.0, rather. So, it's hard to justify it. And on top of that, if, you're putting a power connector on the card, for crying out loud, you would think that there'd be some more feature set that would help benefit this card's future longevity. Again, media transcoding, that's kind of an important feature on a graphics card that people take for granted these days. It's not just for streaming. It's about using Handbrake, for example, to transcode video without having to use the CPU nearly as much. That is a huge deal. That's a huge deal breaker for people, in addition to the VRAM capacity and the ray tracing. But, I mean, those are kind of moot points at this price point. I mean, people really aren't going to care about ray tracing, to be honest with you, but I guess I'm glad it exists, kind of like as well on the RTX 3050, but I don't know. I don't suggest that people, even if those cards do support it, I don't think they should be turning it on. I mean, there's just really no purpose to it with these kinds of cards, at least not right now. Maybe in the future, but it definitely isn't something of a selling point. I mean, I would say if it was something like a 6400 XT or equivalent, like a lower tiered card than a 50 series, I would forgive the 2 monitor outputs, but that just seems silly on a 6500 XT. And then you got AMD thinking they're going to go out there and release like a 6400 XT with, like, what? How are you going to make this thing worse? It's already a turd. Okay, it runs games relatively okay. It's not great, but it's relatively okay. But still, I mean, it's not looking great for this thing's future, and I worry about game longevity. I mean, is a display adapter? Yeah, but it's a crappy one at that. You'd still probably have better luck using a 1030 than this thing, because at least then you don't have to contend with this big cooler and the power connector requirement. But I don't know. Sound off down below in the comments on what you think of the RX 6500 XT. Would I recommend it? No, I really would not recommend the 6500 XT. I would just say, if you're looking for something RDNA 2, just get the 6600 at an absolute minimum, because at least then you're not making nearly as many sacrifices to get into entry-level PC gaming, and the 6600 is inherently a way better card than the 6500 XT. Not amazing, but better. At least you get the hardware-accelerated video transcoding, so you can use Radeon Relive with the 6600, which means you can also just transcode video with Handbrake and so on and so forth. You have PCI Express 4.0 by 8, so you have 8 PCI Express lanes, so you're not nearly as gimped on a 3.0 system, because you have double the theoretical bandwidth, which is pretty nice. I mean, granted, yeah, you do have to contend with an 8-pin power connector versus a 6-pin power connector, but at that point, it's like, well, most power supplies these days are going to at least have one 6+2 connector on them, so I don't think that's big of a deal. Cooler size could be an issue, but I guess it just depends on the vendor of the card and what model you're buying. The biggest things, though, for me, are not just the video transcoding, but, you get double the VRAM, you get 8 gigs of GDDR6 versus 4 gigs of GDDR6. The bandwidth is doubled, so you get a 128-bit memory bus versus a 64-bit memory bus. You also get double the display outputs compared to the 6500 XT on the 6600. You get 4 versus 2. It's just silly. And overall, you're just going to have a much better time. Even ray tracing is better on the 6600. Not amazing, obviously. It's not anywhere where I would consider it to be fantastic, but at least it has a better implementation of ray tracing and so on and so forth. I could go on all day, but at the end of the day, at the end of this video, rather, the 6500 XT is merely just, I would consider to be an entry-level cash grab if you really want my 2 cents. It's not like it's a bad gaming card, especially if you want to play older games on a 4.0 system, but that would really be a niche use case, and it just seems silly to buy a card like this when you could readily buy things from older series or perhaps a higher-end card to do that same function and have a way better experience. So it just seems like it's just the wrong card at the wrong price at the wrong time. And I do think NVIDIA's 3050 is a better solution than the 6500 XT. Even if I don't like NVIDIA's cards, I will still confidently say that the 3050 is a better buy than this, or a 6600 if you can find it for the right price. So that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm going to probably see how this thing ages in the future. We'll see how it goes. But until then, if you like what you saw, don't forget to click the like button down below. And of course, if you don't like that I reviewed this card, then you can hit the dislike button. You won't be able to see the counter, but I'll see it. Neener, neener, neener. If you like to see my content and want to see more of it in the future, then click the subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss when I upload new videos, because they can be hit or miss as far as uploading timing is concerned. But with that having been said, thank you all very much for coming to watch, and hopefully you don't get stuck with a 6500 XT unless you absolutely have to. All right, guys, I'll catch you all in the next video.